The smell of smoke reached me before I even opened my eyes. Not the warm, familiar smoke of the hearth in the great hall. That smoke carried the scent of pine resin and dried herbs, something almost comforting even on the coldest mornings. No. This smoke was thin and bitter, the kind that comes from parchment burning too fast, from something small and deliberate being fed to a flame that had no business being lit before dawn. I sat up on my straw mattress and listened. The cottage was quiet in the way that felt rehearsed, the kind of quiet that two people maintain when they want you to think they are still asleep. I had learned to recognize that silence over the years, the absence of Cecily's restless turning, the absence of Marin's habitual cough in the cold morning air. They were awake. They had been awake before me, which almost never happened unless they wanted something, or unless they had already done something. I rose slowly, my bare feet finding the cold stone floor, and pulled my gray wool cloak over my linen sleeping dress. The single candle on the small table near the window had burned down to almost nothing. Outside, the sky was the deep blue of very early morning, not quite dark, not yet light, that uncertain hour that belongs to no one. I crossed the room and opened the door to the narrow corridor. The smell of burnt parchment was stronger here. My heart dropped before my mind caught up with it. I moved quickly to the bottom of the stairs, where the small iron brazier sat near the entrance, the one my stepmother used to burn herb bundles in winter. The coals inside were still warm, faintly orange at their edges, and among the gray ash, curled and blackened beyond saving, were the unmistakable remnants of a wax seal, the deep red wax of the royal house of Varenhold. I would have recognized that seal in complete darkness. I had spent 3 days studying it, memorizing the exact weight of the parchment, the precise way the royal insignia pressed into the cooling wax, because I had never in my life received anything with that seal on it, not until 4 days ago. I crouched beside the brazier and reached in without thinking, pulling one fragment free. It crumbled between my fingers. Only a single corner of the parchment survived, and on it, in the careful black ink of the royal scribe, I could still read 2 words: humbly invited. That was all. That was enough. I stayed crouched on the cold stone floor for a long moment, staring at those 2 words while the ash settled around my fingers. My chest felt very still, the way a pond goes still before a storm. Not peaceful, but pressurized. The royal summons had arrived 4 days ago by royal messenger, carried on horseback through the mud of the lower village road, sealed with the red wax of King Theron's house. It had been addressed to me, not to my stepmother, Lady Vesta of the House Dawnmere, not to Cecily, her eldest, who had spent the past 2 weeks loudly comparing the shades of ribbon she would wear if invited to the king's selection gathering, not to Marin, who had practiced her curtsy until the wooden floor of her chamber bore marks from her slippers. To me, Penelope, called Penny by those who had forgotten I existed, which was nearly everyone. The messenger had handed it to me directly, because I had been the one who answered the gate that afternoon. Flour still on my hands from the morning's bread, cloak catching in the wind. He had looked at me once, a long, slightly confused look, and then read my name from his list and pressed the envelope into my hands without ceremony. His horse had been impatient, shifting its weight, and he had ridden away before I could fully understand what I was holding. I had not told Cecily or Marin that night. I had hidden the letter beneath a loose stone under my mattress and lain awake in the dark, reading it by memory, trying to decide if it was real. Somehow, they had found it anyway. A sound came from the top of the staircase. A soft, deliberate sound. The kind made by someone who wants to be heard. I stood and turned. Cecily stood at the top of the stairs in her sleeping robe, dark hair loose around her shoulders. One hand resting on the wall with the ease of someone who has been watching for some time. She was beautiful in the way that required effort and awareness. She knew exactly how the early light caught her features, and she had positioned herself accordingly. Beside her, one step lower, Maren stood with her arms crossed, and a small smile pressed flat across her lips, as though she were trying to contain it. "You were going to go," Cecily said. Not a question, not an accusation. Just a statement, offered the way one offers a piece of information they find mildly amusing. I looked at her. I did not answer. "To the King's gathering." She descended one step. "As if you belong there, among noble Omegas and daughters of allied houses." She tilted her head slightly, and her dark eyes moved over me with the practiced ease of someone who has spent years cataloging another person's inadequacies. "In what? That gray cloak? Those hands?" She paused. "Penny." She said my name the way some people say the word nothing, as though the name itself was a summary. Maren let out a short, bright sound, not quite a laugh, but close enough. She pressed her fingers to her lips quickly, as though remembering manners, but her eyes remained full of it. "Mother said it was a mistake," Maren offered from the step. "That the messenger must have confused the household records. You are not registered with the noble Omega census. You have no house standing. You are—" She searched briefly for the word. Unclassified. Unclassified. I had heard that word my entire life, attached to me like a marking brand. In the kingdom of Varenhold, every person above the age of 17 was recorded in the census rolls with their designation: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, or Omega. Omegas were rare and valued, sought for their calming presence and their rare gift of emotional influence over stronger designations. Alphas were dominant, powerful, driven by instinct and authority. Between them, the world was ordered. I had never presented a designation. I had simply remained unclassified. Neither here nor there, belonging to no tier of the hierarchy that governed every social interaction, every marriage arrangement, every formal gathering in the kingdom. It made me, officially, nobody. I looked down at the ash still clinging to my fingers. "You burned it," I said quietly. Cecily descended the last of the stairs and stopped 2 feet from me. Up close, her expression was less triumphant than I expected. There was something harder in it, something that looked, if I was being honest with myself, like fear dressed as contempt. "I saved you the embarrassment," she said. And then she walked past me toward the kitchen corridor, her robe whispering across the stone floor, and I heard Maren following behind her, already beginning to whisper something that ended in both of them laughing. A light, careful sound that echoed briefly in the cold corridor and then disappeared. I stood alone by the brazier. Outside, the sky had shifted from deep blue to the gray pearl of true early morning. The village of Ashven was beginning to wake. I could hear the distant sound of the smithy's bellows starting up, the low call of the geese from the yard of the neighboring farm. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a day that had not yet decided what it would be. I looked at the ash in the brazier for a long moment. Then I went to the kitchen, washed the ash from my hands in the cold basin, and began preparing the morning meal as I did every day. Stirring the porridge pot, stoking the hearth fire, cutting the dark bread into portions, while the gray light grew steadily stronger through the small window above the work table. My hands moved through their routine while my thoughts moved through something much less orderly. The gathering was tonight. By royal summons, all invited were to arrive at the great hall of Varenhold Castle before the evening bell. The journey from Ashven to the castle gates was half a day on foot, longer in poor weather. The road through the Thornfeld Valley was passable but narrow, and the autumn mud made it slow going. I had no letter. I had no seal. I had no proof that I had ever been invited at all. Lady Vesta came down an hour later, wrapped in her fur-trimmed morning robe, her graying hair still in its sleeping braid. She poured herself a cup of warm spiced water from the pot I had prepared and stood by the hearth without speaking to me for several minutes. Then she said, without turning around, "The messenger made an error. I have already sent word to the castle household to correct the census record. You will remain here today and finish the mending in the upper chest. She said it the way she said most things to me, flatly, without particular cruelty, as though I were a piece of furniture that occasionally needed repositioning. I said nothing. She finished her drink, set the cup on the table, and left the kitchen. I stood at the work table with the bread knife in my hand and the morning stretching out before me, silent and unremarkable, while somewhere across the valley, the castle of Varenhold was being prepared for a gathering that had my name on an ash-curled piece of parchment at the bottom of a brazier. I set the knife down. I looked at the small window. The light was growing. The road through Thornfeld Valley would be passable. The autumn mud was thick, but not impassable. I had walked worse on days when the errand was far less important. My gray cloak hung by the door. My hands were clean. And somewhere inside me, in a place that had been quiet for a very long time, the place that Cecily's voice and Lady Vesta's flat commands and Marin's pressed flat smile had pressed smaller and smaller over the years, something shifted. Something that had no name yet, but felt, in that early morning light, remarkably like a decision. I reached for my cloak. I had walked the Thornfeld Road enough times to know its moods. In summer it was almost pleasant. The valley grasses high on either side, the distant sound of the river threading through the low hills, the smell of warm earth rising after rain. In winter, it became something else entirely, a gray and punishing stretch that tested the legs and the spirit equally. But in autumn, which this was, the road existed in an uncomfortable middle ground, the mud deep enough to grip at the heel of every step, the wind carrying the cold edge of what was coming without yet committing to it, the light flat and pale and offering no warmth despite its presence. I had been walking for nearly 2 hours when I heard the horses. I moved instinctively to the edge of the road, stepping up onto the grassy verge as 3 riders came around the long bend ahead. They were moving at a canter, not a full gallop, which told me they were not in distress, but they were wearing the deep charcoal livery of the Varenhold Royal Guard, which told me something else. The road between Ashvin and the castle was not commonly patrolled. Not like this. Not with 3 mounted guards riding out rather than toward. They slowed when they saw me. The lead rider, a broad-shouldered beta, with a close-cut beard and the careful eyes of someone trained to assess situations quickly, pulled his horse to a halt several feet away, and looked me over with the same practiced neutrality I had seen in experienced guardsmen all my life. Not unfriendly, not friendly either, simply measuring. "Traveling alone?" he said. "Yes," I said. "Road to Varenhold?" "Yes." He glanced at the other 2 riders briefly. Something passed between them that I could not quite read, and then looked back at me. His eyes moved to my cloak, my plain linen dress, the small cloth satchel I carried over one shoulder that contained nothing more significant than a piece of bread wrapped in cloth and a spare pair of woolen stockings. "The gathering is by invitation only," he said, not unkindly. "Do you carry your summons?" I held his gaze steadily. "It was destroyed by members of my household this morning, before I could bring it." The silence that followed was not disbelieving exactly. It was the silence of a man recalculating. "Your name?" he said. "Penelope of the House Donmere, called Penny." I paused. "I am aware that I carry no house standing of my own, but the summons was addressed to me directly, by name, by the royal scribe's hand. I was listed on the messenger's roll." The guard studied me for another moment. Then he reached into the leather satchel at his saddle and withdrew a folded piece of parchment, a list, I realized, written in the same careful black ink I had seen on the corner of my destroyed letter. He ran his finger down it slowly. Stopped. His expression shifted, just slightly. Not dramatically, but enough. "You are on the roll," he said, with a note of something that might have been surprise and might have been something more careful than that. He folded the list and returned it to the satchel. Then he looked at his companions again, and something was wordlessly decided. "We are riding back to the castle. You may ride with us." I blinked. "It is a long walk," he said simply, "and the king does not prefer his invited guests to arrive after the evening bell." His invited guests. The phrase landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there, warm and strange, like a coal I was not sure I had earned. I accepted. The castle of Varenhold appeared first as a silhouette, the high towers emerging from the tree line as the road curved upward through the last stretch of Thornfeld Valley, dark against a sky that had turned to hammered copper in the late afternoon light. Closer, the stones revealed themselves as pale gray granite, enormous blocks fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of generations of skilled hands, of a structure built not quickly but carefully, meant to endure. The banners of the royal house, deep charcoal and silver, hung from the gatehouse towers, moving slowly in the autumn wind. The gates were open, torches already burned in the iron brackets along the outer wall, though the sun had not yet fully set. Servants moved in ordered streams across the courtyard, carrying linens, arrangement of branches and late-season flowers in enormous iron stands, rolling casks toward the great hall entrance. Everything was in motion and everything had purpose. I felt immediately, acutely, that I did not match any of it. The guard, whose name I had learned was Corvin, dismounted at the stable yard and handed his horse to a waiting stable hand with the ease of a man who had done so 1,000 times. He spoke briefly with one of the castle servants, a thin woman with a ring of keys at her belt and the expression of someone managing 17 urgent things simultaneously. She glanced at me once, quickly, and then nodded at something Corvin said, and gestured for me to follow her. Her name, I learned, was Bridget. She was a senior household servant of perhaps 40 years, sharp-featured and efficient, and she spoke to me while walking at a pace I had to move quickly to match. "You'll be placed with the other invited Omegas in the eastern antechamber before the gathering begins," she said, navigating a corridor with the confidence of someone who had memorized every stone of this castle. "There are 7 others. You'll be given a chance to refresh yourself before the evening bell. I assume you have no formal gown." "No," I said honestly. She made a sound, not unkind, simply noting a logistical problem. "There are spares kept for exactly this circumstance. Not many and not new, but clean and proper. I will find something in your size." She glanced at me sideways as we walked. "You are smaller than I expected from the name on the roll." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. The eastern antechamber was a room of considerable beauty by any standard I had previously encountered, which was admittedly a modest standard. The walls were hung with tapestries in deep blue and gold, the ceiling was high and vaulted, and a fireplace large enough to stand in crackled warmly at one end of the room. Several young women were already gathered there when Bridget brought me in, some seated, some standing near the fire, all in various states of careful preparation. They looked up when I entered. All of them. The way people look up when something unexpected walks into a room they considered already settled. I recognized the social architecture of that room immediately. I had grown up inside smaller versions of it. The gathering of people who are measuring each other quietly, establishing hierarchies before any official hierarchy has been declared. The girl nearest the fire was tall and copper-haired, wearing a deep green gown with embroidered cuffs, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had already decided she was the most important person present. She looked at my gray cloak and plain linen dress with an expression so carefully neutral it was almost impressive. Beside her sat a younger woman, still older than 20, with soft brown skin and dark eyes that held genuine warmth rather than performance, who offered me a small, real smile when I met her gaze. Her name, I would learn, was Seren. She was a Gamma-born woman from the Northern Territories, invited because of a treaty alliance between her house and the crown, and she had been quietly terrified since she arrived, which made her the most honest person in the room. Bridget installed me in a corner near the secondary hearth, brought me a gown, deep blue, slightly large in the shoulders but otherwise acceptable, made of good wool with simple silver thread at the hem, and told me the evening bell would ring within the hour. I changed behind a folding screen, rebraided my long blonde hair as neatly as I could, with fingers that were not quite steady, and sat in the chair provided. Around me, the other women spoke in low voices. Topics of strategic interest, which noble houses had strong ties to the crown, what was known of the king's preferences, whether the gathering was truly a selection or merely a political formality. The copper-haired girl, whose name was Isolde, daughter of the High Lord of Westamere, spoke with the authority of someone who had studied for this day, the way a warrior studies for battle. She knew things. She stated them without being asked, which was its own kind of declaration. The king has not taken a formal bondmate in 32 years of rule, Isolde said, smoothing the embroidered cuff of her sleeve. He dissolved the last arrangement himself, 7 years ago. House Cauldron. No explanation was ever offered. She let that sit for a moment. He is not an easy alpha. What alpha is, said another woman, a beta named Dara, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, who had been invited as part of a border house delegation. She said it without particular bitterness, just as a statement of fact. There is a difference, Isolde said, between difficult and... She paused, selecting her word with visible care. Unknowable. Seren looked at me from across the room. Do you know anything of him? She asked, directing the question my way with a gentleness that suggested she was offering me an entrance into the conversation, rather than demanding one. I thought about what I knew of King Theron. What anyone in the common villages knew, which was assembled from fragments, the occasional royal messengers passing, the tax collector's authority, the distant rumors that filtered down through markets and tavern talk into the lower villages of Ashvin. I knew he had ruled for over 3 decades. I knew he was considered effective, not beloved, not feared precisely, but respected in the way that a very large and very certain force earns respect. I knew there were scars on his face that no one spoke about directly. And I knew that 7 years ago, when the arrangement with House Cauldron was dissolved, the entire kingdom had gone very quiet for a very specific kind of moment. The kind that happens when something happens and no one is allowed to ask why. Very little, I said honestly. Isolde's gaze moved to me fully for the first time. She took in my face, my braid, the borrowed gown. Her expression remained that careful neutral. But something shifted behind it. Not warmth, but a slight recalibration, as though she had dismissed me as irrelevant and was now running a small, quick check on that decision. The evening bell rang. The sound came through the stone walls deep and resonant, rolling through the castle the way thunder rolls through a valley, filling everything, touching everything, leaving silence in its wake that felt changed from the silence before it. Bridget appeared in the doorway. "It is time," she said. I stood with the others. Serene fell into step beside me naturally, as though we had agreed to it, and I was grateful for her presence in the simple, wordless way you are grateful for warmth when you did not realize you were cold. Isolde moved to the front of the group with the precision of someone who had decided the position was hers. The others arranged themselves in the spaces between, and I walked at the edge of that arrangement, as I had always walked, at every gathering, in every room. Not quite inside, not quite outside. Belonging to no particular tier of the order being established around me. But this time, something was different. This time, I had been called here by name. The doors to the great hall opened before us, and the warmth and candlelight and the low sound of assembled nobles poured out into the corridor like breath. And at the far end of the hall, standing before the high seat with his back to the room, looking at something beyond the tall arched window, was a figure I recognized from no previous meeting, and yet somehow knew immediately. He was larger than I had imagined, and when he turned, slowly, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never needed to rush, His eyes, ice blue and very still, moved across the assembled group at the door and stopped. Not on Isolde, not on Seren, on me. I told myself I had imagined it. That was the sensible thing to do. To look away, to take my place among the others, to let the moment dissolve into the general noise of the gathering, the way a single drop dissolves into a river. I was standing at the edge of a group of women who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this kind of room. I was wearing a borrowed gown that was slightly too wide at the shoulders. My braid was not perfectly neat. My hands, clasped in front of me, still carried the faint roughness of daily kitchen work, the kind that no amount of cold water washing fully removes. It was not possible that the Alpha King of Varenhold had looked at me first, so I told myself I had imagined it, and I looked away, and I followed the others into the great hall. The hall itself was immense, longer than I had expected, with stone pillars rising on either side to support a ceiling of dark timber beams hung with iron chandeliers, each one blazing with dozens of candles. The light they cast was warm and unsteady, moving slightly with the drafts that found their way through the high windows, and it made everything in the room feel slightly alive. The tapestries breathing, the shadows shifting, the faces of the assembled nobles flickering between illumination and darkness as you moved past them. There were perhaps 60 people in the room beyond our small group of invited women. Lords of various houses, advisors in formal robes, high-ranking warriors in polished ceremonial armor, a cluster of older women near the left wall who wore the gray sashes of the Council of Bonds, the body responsible for formally ratifying any bondmate arrangement the king might declare. They watched our entrance with the focused attention of people whose purpose in this room was to evaluate and record. I kept my gaze forward and my chin level, and tried to look as though I belonged here, which was considerably harder than it sounds when you can feel 6 pairs of eyes from the Council of Bonds moving over you, like hands checking for weaknesses in a structure. Isolde moved through the room as though she had been designed for it. She greeted 2 lords by name, accepted a cup of warmed wine from a passing servant with the ease of someone accustomed to being served, and positioned herself naturally in the gravitational center of the room's attention without appearing to try. It was, I had to admit privately, a skill of genuine refinement. Seren stayed near me. She accepted a cup of warm cider and held it with both hands like it was something to anchor herself to. "Is it always like this?" she murmured, without moving her lips very much. "I have no idea," I said honestly. "I've never been to a castle before." She looked at me. "Never?" "The village of Ashven is not known for its proximity to royalty." Something in her expression softened further. She had good eyes, dark and attentive, the kind that missed very little even when the face around them appeared perfectly calm. "I have been to 2 formal gatherings," she said quietly. "One in the Northern Territories, one at House Cauldron's winter seat 3 years ago. They both felt like this, like standing in the middle of a river and trying to appear as though you were simply standing on dry land." I almost smiled. That is exactly what it feels like. "My father prepared me for 6 months," she continued. "He had me practice walking into rooms, just walking in, over and over. He said the entrance was the most important part." She glanced toward Isolde, who was now deep in conversation with a silver-haired lord. I think Isolde's father may have agreed. "And what is the second most important part?" I asked. Seren considered this seriously. "Knowing when to be quiet," she said, "and knowing the difference between quiet that protects you and quiet that erases you." I thought of every meal I had sat through at my stepmother's table, keeping my voice low and my opinions absent, passing bread and refilling cups and existing in the room as little more than a function. I thought of Cecily's voice saying my name the way some people say nothing. "I am still learning that difference," I said. Seren looked at me with something that had graduated from warmth into something more like recognition. She opened her mouth to say something further, but at that moment, a change moved through the room. Not loud, not announced, but unmistakable. The quality of attention shifted the way it does when the most significant person in a space begins to move through it. King Theron had descended from the raised platform at the far end of the hall and was moving among the assembled guests. I had a better view of him now than I had from the doorway. He was taller than the men around him by a measure that was not dramatic, but was consistent, enough to establish presence without requiring effort. His hair was black and braided back from his face in long, tight rows that were gathered at the base of his neck, and they moved slightly across his shoulders as he walked. He wore no crown, not at a gathering like this, I supposed, where the formality was of a different kind. But he wore his authority the way some men wear armor, as something that had become second nature, indistinguishable from the body beneath it. The scar on the left side of his face was more visible than it appeared in the few official portraits I had seen reproduced in charcoal on broadsheets. It ran from just below his cheekbone to the edge of his jaw. Not ragged, but deliberate-looking in the way that old, fully healed marks sometimes are. His eyes were the color of deep winter ice, pale blue with a darkness underneath. And they moved through the room with the careful steadiness of someone who has learned to see everything while appearing to look at nothing in particular. He was flanked by two men, a tall, dark-skinned beta named Aldrich, who served as his primary counsel, and whose expression suggested he had calculated every social variable in the room within the first 4 minutes of entry, and a younger warrior with a shaved head and a long scar across his forearm named Ro, who stood slightly behind and to the right, with the focused stillness of a man whose entire purpose was proximity and readiness. Theron moved through the room and spoke with several lords. The conversations were brief, not dismissive, but economical. He listened more than he spoke, which surprised me. I had expected an alpha of his standing to fill space with sound, to use words the way some men use physical size, as a way of establishing the perimeter of themselves. Instead, he asked questions, short, direct ones. And when people answered, he watched their faces with a concentration that made it clear he was not simply being polite. He was actually listening. He reached Isolde. She handled it beautifully, a graceful dip of acknowledgement, a composed smile, her copper hair catching the candlelight at its best angle. She said something that made the silver-haired lord beside her laugh. Theron did not laugh, but he inclined his head slightly, and his expression, which had been strictly neutral throughout the room, shifted into something that might have been the very beginning of interest. I watched this with no particular feeling I could name cleanly. Not jealousy. That would have required a claim I did not have. Not indifference. That would have required a distance I did not quite feel. Something in between, restless and unnamed. Beside me, Seren said very quietly, "He is coming this way." I followed her gaze. He was. Not directly. He was still speaking with someone near the central pillar. But his trajectory through the room had the steady, unhurried quality of water finding its natural course, and the natural course appeared to be leading toward the corner where Seren and I stood. I straightened slightly, unclenched my hands from each other and let them settle at my sides. Breathed. Aldrich reached us first. He stopped a precise 3 feet away, close enough to indicate intention, far enough to indicate courtesy, and looked at me with the clear, assessing gaze of a man who had already read the guest roll and formed preliminary conclusions. "Penelope of House Dawnmere," he said. Not a question. "Yes," I said. "You arrived on the road with Corvin's patrol." "I did." Something moved in his expression. "Your invitation was destroyed before you could bring it." I held his gaze. "Yes." He studied me for a moment longer. Then he stepped aside, and King Theron stood before me. Up close, the authority of him was different from what I had observed across the room. From a distance it was structural. The height, the bearing, the way people arranged themselves around him without appearing to decide to. Up close it was something more specific. It was the quality of his attention. The way he looked at me was not the way the Council of Bondswomen had looked at me, checking for weaknesses. And it was not the way Cecily looked at me, cataloging insufficiencies. It was simply direct, present. As though I were the only person in the room, and he had not yet decided what to make of that fact. "You walked the Thornfeld Road alone this morning," he said. His voice was low and even, shaped by years of command into something that did not need to be raised to fill a space. "I did," I said. "Your invitation was destroyed." "Yes. And you came anyway." It was not quite a question, but it held the shape of one, an open space at the end of it, waiting. I considered giving a modest answer, something careful and deflecting, the kind of answer I had trained myself to produce in rooms where being too visible felt dangerous. But something about the directness of his gaze made the careful answer feel like a waste of whatever this moment was. "It had my name on it," I said simply. "That has never happened before. I thought it was worth a long walk to understand why." Something shifted in his expression. It was small. Most people in the room would not have noticed it. But it was there. A fractional change, somewhere between his eyes and the set of his jaw, as though something I had said had landed in a place he had not entirely expected. He held my gaze for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Then Aldrich leaned in and murmured something at his shoulder. Something about the council's schedule, I thought. And Theron's attention pulled back toward the room. He inclined his head to me, a brief and formal acknowledgement, and moved on. I stood very still and breathed. Seren appeared at my elbow. "What did he say to you?" she asked, in the tone of someone who has witnessed something they cannot quite classify. "Nothing remarkable," I said. But my hands, I noticed, were no longer entirely steady, and across the room, Isolde had seen the exchange. Her expression, when I met it by accident, was still perfectly composed, but her eyes had changed, narrowed by a fraction, sharpened by something that had moved into them like a draft moving under a door. The gathering continued, the candles burned, the wine circulated, and I stood in my borrowed gown in a castle I had never entered before today, thinking about the way a man who rules an entire kingdom had stopped, however briefly, however unexplainably, in front of me. Not Isolde. Not Seren. Me. Outside the high windows, the autumn night had fully settled over Varenhold. The wind moved through the battlements with a low, sustained sound, like the castle itself was breathing. And somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet and persistent as an ember that refuses to go out, a thought formed. Something has begun. 3 days passed before anyone knocked on the door of the room I had been given. I had not expected to stay. That first night, after the gathering ended and the candles burned low, and the lords and their retinues began the gradual, formal business of departing, Bridget had appeared at my elbow with the same efficient quietness she seemed to apply to everything, and informed me that the king had extended an invitation, a real one, verbal and witnessed by Aldrich, for the invited women to remain at Varenhold for a period of observation. 7 days. During which time the king would meet with each of them in a series of structured settings, shared meals, council observations, walks in the castle grounds, before making any formal declaration. Isolde had received this news with visible satisfaction, smoothing her embroidered cuff and saying nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Seren had looked at me with wide eyes and mouthed something I interpreted as 7 days. 2 of the other women had declined, one citing family obligations in the eastern provinces, one simply looking at the castle walls with the expression of someone who had realized they did not want what they had thought they wanted, and was honest enough to admit it. That left 5 of us. Isolde, Seren, Dara, the plain-spoken Beta. A quiet noblewoman named Fenna from the southern coast who had said almost nothing all evening and seemed to prefer it that way, and me. My room was small by castle standards, which still made it larger than anything I had slept in at Ashfen. Stone walls, a single tapestry in faded blue, a narrow bed with actual wool blankets, a window that looked out over the inner courtyard, where the stable yard was visible in the early mornings through the mist. I lay awake the first night listening to the castle settle, the deep, slow sounds of old stone contracting in the cold, the distant change of the night guard, the wind against the shutters, and felt the particular strangeness of being somewhere entirely new, in a situation entirely outside anything I had mapped for myself. I had no plan. I had arrived without one, which was perhaps the most honest thing about me. The second day brought a shared morning meal in a smaller dining chamber off the great hall. Round table, no head position, which I suspected was deliberate. Theron was not present. Aldrich was, seated at the table with a cup of dark tea and a stack of correspondence he worked through with the focus of a man who considered eating primarily a logistical necessity. He spoke when spoken to, and answered questions directly without elaborating, which made him either very efficient or very private, possibly both. Isolde managed the meal the way she managed every room, by becoming its center through the application of precisely calibrated attention. She asked Aldrich about the northern border situation, which turned out to be a genuinely intelligent question that shifted the conversation into territory where her knowledge of interhouse politics became evident and useful. I watched her and felt something that was not resentment, and was not admiration exactly, but lived somewhere in the complicated territory between them. The recognition of skill in someone whose company you did not entirely find comfortable. Seren sat beside me and ate her bread, with the focused relief of someone who had not slept well and was using food as a way of grounding herself. Under the table, she pressed her knee briefly against mine. Not romantically, simply in the way that people who have identified each other as allies in uncertain rooms sometimes communicate without words. I pressed back slightly, and she relaxed a fraction. Fenna, the quiet southerner, ate her meal with her eyes on her plate, and her attention, I gradually realized, on everything. She was one of those people who appear absent, and are in fact more present than anyone else in the room. She had dark auburn hair pinned back simply, and gray eyes that moved around the table in quick, light sweeps when no one was looking directly at her. I filed her away as someone worth understanding better. Dara ate efficiently and asked Aldrich about the castle's garrison numbers, in a tone that suggested she found military logistics genuinely interesting, which seemed to briefly surprise Aldrich into something approaching warmth. On the third day, in the afternoon, the knock came. I was at the window when it happened, watching two stable hands work with a young horse in the courtyard below, a gray mare who was objecting to something about the saddle with the dignified persistence of an animal that has decided it has a position on the matter. I had been watching them for perhaps 20 minutes, which tells you something about the specific quality of waiting that the previous 3 days had produced. The knock was deliberate. 3 times, evenly spaced. Not a servant's knock. Servants knocked differently, lighter and faster, with an apologetic quality. This knock had no apology in it. I crossed the room and opened the door. King Theron stood in the corridor. He was not in the ceremonial bearing of the gathering. No formal arrangement of attendance, no deliberate staging of authority. He wore a dark leather tunic, the crossed harness straps across his chest, bracers at his wrists. His black braids were gathered back but not formally arranged, as though he had simply pulled them away from his face that morning without particular attention to the result. He looked, I realized with a slight internal adjustment, like a man who had come from somewhere and was going somewhere else and had stopped in between. Ro stood several feet behind him in the corridor, looking at the middle distance with the professional detachment of someone who has learned to be present without appearing to watch. "Lady Penelope," Theron said. "My Lord King," I said. And then, because I could not think of anything more useful, "I did not expect you." "No," he said, "I expect not." He looked past me briefly at the room, then back at me. "I would like to walk, if you are willing." It was phrased as a request. Genuinely, not performatively. There was no pressure in it, no assumption. which somehow made it more difficult to process than a command would have been, because a command requires only compliance, while a genuine request requires an actual decision. "Yes," I said. "Give me a moment." He waited in the corridor without apparent impatience while I found my gray cloak, the original one, not the borrowed finery, and fastened it at the throat. I did not know why I chose it over the blue gown. Perhaps because it was mine. The castle grounds in autumn were a different world from the great hall's candlelit formality. We walked through the inner courtyard, past the herb garden where the last of the season's growth clung to the beds in brittle clusters, through an arched passageway in the eastern wall that opened onto a wide stone walkway along the ramparts. The view from there extended across the Thornfeld Valley. The road I had walked 3 days ago, now a thin, dark line through the gold and brown of the autumn trees. The distant low rooftops of Ashfen barely visible at the valley's far edge. Theron walked at a pace that was not slow, exactly, but was clearly adjusted, not his natural stride, which I suspected covered ground considerably faster. Ro followed at enough distance to be present without being part of the conversation. The wind on the ramparts was sharp and cold, and carried the smell of coming rain. We walked for a while without speaking, which did not feel uncomfortable. It felt, in a way I could not entirely account for, like something being established. Like the silence itself was a kind of testing ground, and we were both moving through it carefully, taking our footing. "You grew up in Ashfen," he said eventually, not looking at me, looking out over the valley. "Yes," I said, "in the Dawnmere household. In the household of Lady Vesta, who married my father when I was 9. He passed 4 years later." I kept my voice even. After that, I remained in the household in the capacity of, I considered the word, a useful presence. A pause. A servant. Not formally designated as one, I said, which made it, in some ways, more complicated. He turned his head slightly to look at me. The scar on his jaw caught the flat afternoon light clearly from this angle. "In what way?" "A servant has a defined position," I said. "Defined duties, defined standing, defined treatment. The parameters are known. A person who exists in an ambiguous position, useful but unacknowledged, has none of those definitions. You are always slightly uncertain of what you are permitted and what you are not. You learn to make yourself small enough that the question rarely comes up." Something moved in his expression. Not pity. I would have closed that conversation immediately if it had been pity. It was something more considered than that, as though what I had said had connected to something in his own understanding that he had not previously organized into words. "You were unclassified on the census," he said. "Yes. That is unusual past the age of 22. "I am aware," I said. "I have never been entirely sure whether it represents an absence or simply a designation the current system has no category for." He was quiet for a moment. Below us in the courtyard, the gray mare was still being worked by the stable hands. I could hear the soft sounds of hooves on packed earth, the low voice of the handler. "The summons to the gathering," Theron said. "It was sent to you specifically, not as part of a household allocation." I looked at him. "I did not know that." "Aldrich identified your name through a secondary assessment process," he said, with the careful phrasing of someone choosing how much to explain. "There are individuals in every census district who carry certain qualities that standard designation does not capture. The assessment looks for them separately." He paused. "You were found that way." I held that information for a moment, turning it over carefully. "What qualities?" I asked. He looked out over the valley again. The copper light of late afternoon was beginning to deepen toward the amber of early evening, and it caught the edges of the Thornfeld tree line and held them briefly brilliant. "Steadiness," he said, "under conditions designed to produce instability." Another pause, shorter. "And honesty, which is rarer than steadiness and more difficult to assess. The wind moved between us, cold and salt-edged from some distant weather front, pulling a loose strand of my blonde braid across my face. I reached up and tucked it back without thinking. "Who destroyed your invitation?" he asked, quietly, without looking at me. The question arrived without warning, and for a moment I simply held it, feeling the edges of it, the weight of what answering would require. Not because the truth was complicated, because saying it aloud in front of this man, in this place, felt like crossing a threshold I could not uncross. "My stepsisters," I said. "They burned it in the brazier before dawn." He said nothing immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It had a texture to it, dense and considering. "And your stepmother?" he said. "She sent word to the castle household the same morning," I said, "to have the census record corrected. She told me the messenger had made an error." Theron turned from the valley view and looked at me fully. The ice-blue eyes were very steady. Something in them had changed from the polite assessment of the gathering. It was more direct now, more unguarded. And the combination of that directness and those particular eyes produced a feeling in my chest that I noted carefully, and then set aside to examine later, when I was alone. "The record was not corrected," he said. "No," I said. "Apparently not." "Because there was no error." "No," I agreed. "There was not." He held my gaze for a moment, that lasted several seconds longer than social convention required, and then turned back toward the walkway and began moving again, slowly, in the direction of the inner courtyard passage. "Walk with me tomorrow as well," he said. It was phrased as a request again. Barely. It was perhaps 1 degree of certainty away from simply being a statement of fact. I fell into step beside him. "Yes," I said. And somewhere at the far edge of the thorn-felled valley, barely visible through the trees, the rooftops of Ashfin caught the last of the day's light and then disappeared into the gathering dark. The rain came on the 5th day. It arrived without drama. No storm, no thunder, simply a steady gray curtain that descended over Varenhold in the early morning and remained. The courtyard stones darkened. The torches in the outer brackets hissed. The valley disappeared behind a wall of low cloud that erased the tree line and the road, and every familiar landmark until the castle existed as its own separate world, cut off from everything beyond its walls. I stood at my window and watched it, and thought about Ashfin. About the kitchen hearth and the cold stone floor and the sound of ash settling in a brazier before dawn. I thought about Cecily's voice saying my name the way some people say nothing. I thought about how many mornings I had stood at a smaller, lower window in a house where I was necessary but unwelcome, watching rain fall on a road that led somewhere I had never been permitted to imagine going. I was still standing there when Bridget knocked and entered with the morning's message. She placed it on the small table without ceremony. A folded piece of parchment, unsealed. My name written on the outside in a hand I did not recognize but which was clearly not a scribe's formal script. More direct. Less ornamented. I waited until she left to open it. "The council session this morning is open to observation. Aldrich will bring you." T1 sentence. No title, no formal address. Just the initial. Blunt and certain at the bottom of the page like a period at the end of an argument. I dressed carefully and went. The council chamber was a long room adjacent to the great hall, its walls lined with maps and bound record volumes and the kind of accumulated documentation that represents decades of governance made physical. 7 council members sat at the long table, older men and women of various houses, advisors, 1 representative of the Western Military Command. Theron sat at the table's head, not elevated above the others, but clearly its organizing point, the way a keystone is not the largest part of an arch, but is the part everything else depends on. Aldrich placed me in a chair along the side wall, slightly apart from the 2 other observers present, a Lord Secretary and a young man I did not recognize who appeared to be recording the proceedings in careful script. I was the only woman in an observing position. I noted this without surprise and settled in to listen. The session concerned a border dispute in the Northern Territories, the same region Seren came from. I realized, where two allied houses had been in escalating conflict over grazing rights for the past 18 months. The dispute had reached the point where it required formal royal arbitration, and the question before the council was the terms. What followed was 2 hours of careful, occasionally heated debate. I watched Theron through most of it. He spoke perhaps a quarter as much as the most vocal council members, but each time he did, the room reorganized itself around what he said. Not because he raised his voice or demanded it, but because what he said was usually the thing everyone else had been circling without landing on. He had a particular quality of thought that I found myself identifying and studying. He waited until the argument had exhausted its own surface energy, and then he reached underneath it and found the actual question that no one had yet directly addressed. At one point, when the debate had reached an impasse over boundary markers that both houses claimed as ancestral, Theron set down the document he had been reviewing and said very quietly, "What does either house actually need? Not want. Need." The room went briefly silent, and then the real conversation began. I thought about that question for the rest of the morning. He found me after the session in the corridor outside the council chamber, where I had stopped to look at a large map of the kingdom mounted on the wall. A beautiful thing, hand-drawn on treated hide, the rivers rendered in blue ink, the mountain ranges in careful hatched lines, the borders of each territory marked in different colors. He stopped beside me and looked at the map with me for a moment. "What do you think?" he said. "About the council session?" "Yes." I considered being careful. Then I considered that he had sent me an informal note with a single initial at the bottom, and that he had walked with me on the ramparts and asked me direct questions and listened to the answers with the same quality of attention he brought to his counsel, and I decided that careful was probably not what this conversation required. "The question you asked," I said, "about need versus want, it changed the room." "It usually does," he said. "Not with pride. Simply as an observation." "The Northern House representatives," I continued. "The younger one, Lord Bren's second. He knew the answer immediately. You could see it in his face. He had known it for some time. He simply had not been asked directly." Theron looked at me sideways. "You noticed that?" "It was visible if you were watching his face instead of the document he was holding." A pause. Then, "Most people in that room were watching the documents." "I had no documents," I said. "I was watching the people." Something in his expression did what it had done on the ramparts. That small, precise shift, as though something had arrived somewhere it had not expected to arrive. He turned back to the map. "The border dispute will be resolved within a fortnight," he said. "Lord Bren's house needs water access for winter. The other house needs the eastern grazing fields acknowledged formally. Neither needs the boundary markers they have been arguing over for 18 months. He traced a line on the map lightly with one finger. They were fighting about the symbol of the thing, not the thing. "People often do," I said quietly. He looked at me then, fully, with the directness that I had come to recognize as simply the way he looked at things he was genuinely trying to understand. The ice-blue eyes and the scar, and the absolute stillness of a man who has learned to carry enormous weight without visibly bending under it. "Penny," he said. It was the first time he had used the shortened form of my name. It landed differently than it ever had before, not as a diminishment, the way Cecily used it, but as something chosen, personal, deliberate. "Yes," I said. "I am going to ask you something that falls outside the formal structure of this gathering." "All right." "What do you want?" He held my gaze. "Not what you think is available to you. Not what you believe you are permitted to want. What do you actually want?" The question arrived with the same quality as the one he had asked in the council chamber. Underneath the surface of everything, reaching for the real thing. And it deserved the same kind of answer. I was quiet for a moment, not because I did not know, but because I was deciding, finally and with full awareness, to say it aloud. To be somewhere I am not invisible, I said. To have my name said as though it means something. To be useful in ways that are acknowledged rather than simply expected. I paused. And to stop making myself small enough that the question of what I deserve never has to come up. He held my gaze for a long time. Outside, the rain continued its steady work against the castle stones. "Those are not small things," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "They are not." The formal declaration came on the 7th day, in the Great Hall, before the assembled council and the remaining guests. Theron stood at the front of the room and spoke with the economy of a man who chooses words the way a careful craftsman chooses tools, precisely, and only what is needed. He dissolved the gathering with respect and formal gratitude to each invited woman. Isolde received this with perfect composure, her chin level, her copper hair immaculate. And if there was anything beneath that composure, it was entirely her own. Seren caught my eye across the room and offered a small, real smile. The kind that means I understand, and I am glad for you, which is one of the rarest and most generous expressions one person can offer another. And then Theron spoke my name. Full and clear, in front of the council and the lords and the gray-sashed women of the Bond Council. Not Cecily's version of it. Not Lady Vesta's flat erasure of it. Penelope. As though it had always meant exactly this. We were bonded on the last day of autumn, in a small ceremony in the castle's inner chapel. Stone walls, candlelight, the smell of pine resin and cold air. Seren standing as my witness with her hands clasped and her dark eyes bright. Aldrich stood for Theron with the formal gravity of a man who takes his responsibilities seriously, and always has. Theron took my hands in his, steady, warm, certain, and said the words of the old bonding rite in a low, even voice. And when he reached the final line and his ice-blue eyes met mine, there was nothing performed in them. Only the same direct, present quality that had looked at me across a great hall full of people and stopped. Rowe, standing near the door with his arms folded, cleared his throat once at the end. I suspected this was as close as he came to visible emotion, and I found I appreciated it enormously. Afterward, Theron and I walked the ramparts alone in the early evening. The rain had finally passed, and the sky above Thornfeld Valley was the deep, clean blue that follows a long rain, the kind of blue that feels earned. Below us, the road to Ashfin was visible again, the mud-dark line threading through the newly washed trees. I looked at it for a long time. "Are you thinking about the road?" Theron asked. "I am thinking about the morning I walked it," I said, with ash on my fingers and no letter and no reasonable expectation of anything. He was quiet beside me. His shoulder was close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth of him through the autumn air. "You came anyway," he said. "It had my name on it," I said. That had never happened before. His hand found mine at the rampart's edge, not dramatically, simply found it. The way things find their place when they have been moving toward it for some time without either party quite admitting the direction of travel. Below us, the valley settled into its evening quiet. The torches along the outer wall began to be lit one by one, small flames appearing in the growing dark, steady and certain against the cold. I was not invisible. I was not small. I was not standing at the edge of a room that had not decided whether to include me. I was standing exactly where my name had always been leading me. I simply had not known it yet. And that, at last, was enough.